I have photographed 400 weddings, maybe more, and I stopped counting somewhere around the time my niece started complaining about kneeling for the garter shots. You'd think after that many evenings of forced toasts and overcooked salmon, nothing in a reception hall could still surprise me. I had resigned myself, at 68, to a quiet professional cynicism: load the camera, work the room, collect the check, go home to a cat who doesn't care how the bride looked in the light. I had learned, over 30 years behind the lens, to expect the evening's drama to come from a drunk best man or a mother-in-law seated too close to an ex. I did not expect it from the woman taking coats by the door. But I will tell you about the night a coat-check woman sat down at a piano in a converted barn outside Millbrook, and a man who had spent 30 years building a wall finally watched it come down one note at a time. I have thought about that night more than almost any other I've worked, and I find I still don't have the right words for it, only the photographs, and even those don't quite hold what it felt like to be standing there when it happened. The venue was called Aldergate Barn, all exposed beams and hanging Edison bulbs, the kind of rustic luxe setting that costs more than most people's first house. The wedding planner was a man named Desmond Whitlock, a name you'd remember if you met him, mostly because he made sure you did. Sharp suit, sharper voice, the particular tightness around the eyes of a man who has spent his whole career making other people's days perfect while his own unraveled quietly in the background. I'd worked with Desmond twice before. He was good at his job. He was not, by any account I'd heard, a kind man. The trouble started at 7:40, when the hired pianist, a contracted music student from the city, 2 years running with this venue, called to say her car had thrown a rod on the interstate and she was sitting on the shoulder waiting for a tow. Cocktail hour was already underway. 200 guests in linen and chiffon, the kind of crowd that notices a silence the way they'd notice a stain on a tablecloth. Desmond took the news standing by the bar, and I watched his jaw do something complicated. He didn't yell. He never yelled. He just got quieter, which with Desmond was worse. "We need noise," he said to no one and everyone. Background. Something. Anything that isn't this. This being the murmur of 200 people trying to make small talk over the absence of music, which is a stranger silence than you'd expect, present, almost embarrassing, like a held breath nobody can release. I was crouched near the gift table, getting a candid of the flower girl picking at her sash, when I heard him say it. Heard the particular tone a man uses when he's decided to make a joke at someone else's expense because his own evening is falling apart. "You," he said, snapping his fingers toward the coat check booth at the edge of the hall. "You play piano, don't you?" "Everybody plays a little piano." The woman behind the booth was named Vivian Pell. I knew her name only because I'd seen it on her name tag, small and silver, pinned slightly crooked to a cardigan the color of weak tea. She was somewhere in her 60s, gray hair pulled back simply, the kind of face you'd call kind without being able to say exactly why. She had spent the evening hanging coats and handing out tickets with small numbered tabs, the sort of job that exists at the edges of a room, necessary and invisible in the same breath. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The piano." Desmond gestured at the baby grand sitting dark and abandoned near the dance floor, draped in nothing more than the low gold light of the Edison bulbs. "Sit down, play something. Anything simple. Just so the room doesn't notice we've got dead air for an hour." A ripple of laughter went through the nearest cluster of guests, not cruel, exactly, just the easy laughter of people glad the awkwardness had found a new target. Someone's cousin in a seersucker jacket said, "Go on, give us a tune," and clinked his glass like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Vivian looked at the piano. Then at Desmond. Then, for one strange second, directly at me, and I lowered my camera because something in her face made me feel like I shouldn't be photographing this part. "I haven't played in front of people in some time," she said. "Doesn't have to be Carnegie Hall," Desmond said, already turning away, already half finished with her in his mind. "Just fill the gap." I want to tell you I saw something in her face right then, some flicker of the thing that was coming, but the truth is I didn't. She looked, if anything, faintly amused. The kind of amusement a person wears when they've decided, after a long internal negotiation, to let the world underestimate them one more time. She came out from behind the coat check booth, smoothed the front of her cardigan, and walked to the piano the way you'd walk to a chair you'd sat in 1,000 times before, no hesitation, no searching for the bench, just a settled, unhurried certainty that made absolutely no sense for a coat check attendant approached on a whim. I lifted my camera again. Force of habit. I didn't expect to need the shot. The room had gone half attentive, half amused, the particular energy of 200 people waiting for something to be a little embarrassing. A flute clinked somewhere. Desmond had already turned back to the caterer, his shoulders already moving on to the next fire. Vivian sat. She adjusted the bench 2 inches closer with the back of her knee, a small mechanical motion, the kind you only learn from doing it for years, and laid her hands on the keys the way you'd lay your hand on the shoulder of an old friend. The first note was quiet. Almost apologetic. The second note answered it, and something in my chest went very still. I am not a musician. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I couldn't tell you the name of the piece if my life depended on it, not in that moment. What I could tell you is that within 4 bars, the seersucker cousin's laughter had died somewhere in his throat, and within 8, the low murmur of 200 conversations had thinned to nothing, the way a tide pulls back before a wave you didn't see coming. It was Brahms, I learned later. An intermezzo, slow and aching, the kind of piece that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive, like a memory you didn't know you'd misplaced. Vivian's hands moved without looking at them, her eyes half closed, her whole small frame leaning into the music the way a tree leans into wind it's used to. Desmond turned around. I caught it through the lens. I'd raised the camera without quite deciding to, the exact second his face changed. The brittle, managerial half-smile he'd worn all evening simply slid off, like something had reached up and removed it. He stood very still near the bar, a half-poured glass forgotten in his hand, and stared at the woman he'd handed a piano to as a punchline 20 seconds earlier. The piece built. Not loud, Vivian never played loud, not once that whole performance, but deep, the kind of sound that fills a room not through volume but through the sheer unwillingness to be anything less than honest. Her left hand carried something heavy and patient underneath while her right hand sang above it, and the 200 guests who had been waiting to be politely entertained were instead leaning forward in their chairs, forks abandoned, the bride herself turned fully around in her seat with one hand pressed flat against her chest. I have photographed a great many weddings. I have never photographed a silence like that one, full, total, the kind where you can hear the piano sustain ringing in the rafters because nobody in the room is breathing loud enough to cover it. Desmond set his glass down. He didn't seem to notice he'd done it. He took 2 steps toward the piano and then stopped, as though his legs had taken him further than the rest of him had agreed to. I learned the rest of it later, in pieces, the way you learn most true things, not all at once, but stitched together from what people say when they think no one's listening. Desmond Whitlock's mother had been a concert pianist. A real one, the kind with a name in old programs, before arthritis took her hands in her 50s and the rest of her not long after. He had grown up backstage, he told me much later, sitting on cold folding chairs while she rehearsed, and the piece she had played more than any other, the one she hummed doing dishes, the one she'd played the night before she died, was a Brahms intermezzo in A major. He had not heard it played live, he said, in 31 years. He had built an entire career around filling silences so he would never have to sit in one long enough to remember it. Vivian, for her part, had been a concert pianist herself once, decades ago, before a different kind of life took over, a husband, children, a long stretch of years where the piano sat closed in a parlor she rarely entered. She'd taken the coat check job, she told a guest afterward, simply because her daughter worked the venue and the extra money helped with the grandson's tuition. Nobody had asked what she used to do. She hadn't offered it. It is, I think, the quiet tragedy and quiet dignity of a certain kind of person, that the world stops asking what you once were, and you let it. The final movement of the piece slowed, the notes spacing further apart, each one allowed to hang and fade before the next arrived, and I swear the whole barn leaned in with it, as though 200 people had collectively decided to hold their breath until the very last chord. She let the final note ring. She did not rush to lift her hands. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the bride stood up first, her gown rustling loud in that silence, and began to clap, and the sound seemed to break something open in the room, because suddenly everyone was on their feet, chairs scraping, glasses set down too fast, 200 people rising in a single ragged wave, applause crashing up into the rafters like something let off a leash. Vivian sat with her hands in her lap, blinking, the way you blink when you've come up from somewhere deep and the air feels strange against your face. Desmond did not clap. He stood very close to the piano, close enough that I had to step back to keep him in frame, and when she finally looked up at him, he opened his mouth and nothing came out. Not an apology. Not a joke to cover the moment, which I think was the thing he reached for first and found, for once in his professional life, entirely absent. My mother used to play that, he finally said, and his voice did not sound like the voice that had told her to fill a gap an hour before. I know, Vivian said gently. I heard her play it once, a long time ago, at a recital in the city. I never forgot it. He didn't ask how she knew it was his mother's piece. I don't think he needed to. Some things in a room like that simply announce themselves, the way grief does, the way recognition does, without requiring an explanation that would only get in the way. He pulled out the bench beside her, there was room enough for two, just barely, and sat down without being invited, the wedding planner who managed every detail of every room he entered, sitting silent and undone beside a coat-check woman, while 200 guests slowly settled back into their seats and the band, mercifully, did not rush to fill the quiet that followed. I lowered my camera. There are moments you don't photograph, not because the light is wrong, but because some things are not yours to keep. I drove home past midnight with the kind of quiet sitting in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, not since my own wife used to hum something at the stove while she cooked, years and years ago now, a tune I couldn't have named either, not until that night, when somewhere in that crowded barn, a woman they'd handed a piano as a joke reminded an entire room what it sounds like when someone finally stops performing dignity and simply has it, unasked, in their hands. I think about the seersucker cousin sometimes, the one who'd laughed loudest and clinked his glass. I saw him later, near the bar, talking quietly to his wife, and whatever he said made her reach over and take his hand. I don't know what passed through him in those 4 bars when his laughter died in his throat, but I'd guess it was something close to what passed through the rest of us, the small, humbling recognition that we'd all been about to enjoy watching someone be embarrassed, and instead we'd been given something we hadn't earned and would not soon forget. I still have the photograph. Desmond beside her on the bench, his head bowed, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder, the chandelier bulbs gone soft and gold above them both. I don't show it to clients. It isn't really a wedding photograph at all. It's a photograph of a debt being paid 30 years late, and of a room that walked in expecting cake and dancing and walked out, instead, remembering what it means to truly listen.